questions will be directed to us. Plus, we have a few here with us. They will also ask questions. But before we get to that, I thought we'd just so that you're prepared for the conversation, I thought we'll start by looking at some of the things that you found influential in terms of your reading as a young person, right? And we'd also like to get you to talk a little bit about your writing process. I'm sure you've done it many times, but it's going to be new for our students.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd also want to talk to you a little bit about what happens as you process the multiple narratives and voices that you come across as you begin stepping out, looking at a specific corner of the world. So again, we're still talking about process, but that's one of the things I'm fascinated by. And I'm also interested in how you raise political questions and the process of, widening the conversation around political questions, especially in contexts like ours, where, things are rapidly getting extremely polarized, right? So these are some of the things we'd like to look at today. But it's meant to be a light, freewheeling conversation. These are some of the small pegs around which this meeting is organized. And then we'll see what the students have to say.
Okay. Well, you might have to remind me of some of the questions, but the first couple I have down here, you asked about my reading.
Yes.
I was a younger person. It was pretty eclectic.
Mm-hmm.
I read a fair amount of history. I was interested in history from a pretty young age, so that mattered to me a lot.
Okay.
And because it was just interesting. I mean, it's a story of people. And they often seemed very much like myself and the people around me. A lot of things change and a lot of things don't change, let's say that. And that's something I learned from my reading. But as I got a bit older and became interested in journalism, I began reading people like Hunter S. Thompson. He's the American writer your students, I'm sure, know, who did some interesting books. For example, he did a book called Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail about the 1972 presidential election. And as crazy a writer as he is, he's kind of nutty in a way, the way he writes, but he really knew his politics and he really cared about what was going on. And both things really come across. And I was very captured by how entertaining, let's say, in the best sense, a book like that could be, even though it's about the nuts and bolts of politics. He made it really engaging. And there's some others. There's a writer named Michael Herr who wrote about the Vietnam War, a book called Dispatches. And what I liked about that book is, rather than just going through the battles, for example, he just gave you a feeling of what it was like to be on the ground. So you could sort of, you could sort of almost see the dust on your own shoes after you'd finished reading his book. So that became pretty influential for me as far as writers go. There are others, of course, but those are maybe the main two that inspired me journalistically, let's say, as far as narrative nonfiction. I still read a lot of fiction too, because I find that fiction helps. Reading really good writers of fiction can help inform how you put a narrative together and how you make a story interesting. So I read, to this day, I read fiction as well as nonfiction. Now, you asked about my writing process. Well, I do mostly journalism. So when I go into the field, I'm mostly behaving like a journalist. I take a lot of notes. I record conversations. I take pictures for reference. I seldom sketch. In other words, I'm not really emphasizing in my own mind like my own drawing at that time, because I've been trained really traditionally. I actually have a degree in journalism. So I've been trained traditionally just to ask questions, interview people. But when I'm interviewing them, especially about, let's say, the past experiences that I myself didn't witness, I ask them visual questions so they can help describe what the scene was like. That way it's better for me to draw it. Then I look through a lot of archival material as well to see what things looked like in the past. So I get all my notes. I come back home. I write a full script, which is always subject to change, but pretty much I spend some weeks writing a script. I never know when I'm writing how long the process will take. When I'm drawing, I have a fairly better idea of how long each page will take. But I finish writing and then I draw. And I don't storyboard like a lot of cartoonists do. I don't, as I'm going with the writing, I don't sort of give myself visual clues because some of my books take years to do. I want something spontaneous to do every day when I'm drawing that isn't set in stone by, a script. And that's sort of it. So now you had a couple more questions and you might want to remind me.
I have a lot more questions now. I started listening to you. So I'll get started on those by saying how much I like the phrase you used, the dust settling on your shoes. I think it does something very evocative about the experience of reading. Right? It becomes an act of sharing. It becomes an act of companionship. I love that description. Right? In the world of academics, we set a lot of store by something a social scientist said, a man named Clifford Geertz, who spoke of thick description. Right? He was very tired of the way in which academic writing tended to be very verbose and very dry at the same time. And he wanted a form of writing that would allow the social scientist to be able to get to the materiality of the rich materiality of the world that he was dealing with. And I think you've said it a lot better than any of us could have said it when you said the dust on your shoes. Right? I'm still sort of processing that phrase. I loved it very much. I also like the thing you said about not settling to draw till you reached a point of readiness or a point of fullness, perhaps. Right? I'm just curious about this imagination that you bring to bear upon drawing. We live in a world that's dominated by visual clutter, right? There's so much acting upon us visually, right? I'm just curious to know whether cinema enters your process of preparation. What's your relationship with cinema?
Well, I'm sure it does in some way. I think just by osmosis, we learn some things visually from cinema and even how to construct frames. I remember when I was a kid, I really liked the old spaghetti westerns. The movies by Sergio Leone. Yeah, I love those movies. And I loved close-ups of the faces and how it didn't romanticize things so much. The faces were often ugly and they were sweating. And I liked that. And so it felt more real to me. So that was important. But generally, I'm often thinking about this because there are a lot of cartoonists almost want to go into film. They think of it as a higher art form. It's definitely a much, much more popular art form, probably the most popular art form. But I really have sort of no desire to move over into film as a job, because I think there are things you can do with comics that you cannot do with film. And I realize comics is considered a sequential art, and I think there's a truth to that. You can show action over a series of panels, but there's a lot of other things you might be able to do with comics that don't really fit sort of a cinematic model. So as I let my cinematic influences be a bit more passive in how I work, and I'm not looking for cinema to give me clues.
Okay. I think I sense that in the way you spoke about drawing from fiction and drawing from looking at the archives, right? But cinema seemed curiously absent in that description. Right? I also enjoyed the point you made about the spaghetti westerns. One of the greatest Indian films of all time is what we'd call a curry western. It's a remake. It's modeled on the spaghetti westerns and on their loving relationship with the traditional western. It's a film called Sholay. I don't suppose you watched too many Indian films, but have you come across any?
I've had some. I used to have an Indian roommate in New York, so
Oh, okay.
through her maybe a few. Of course, I've seen some a bit more modern Indian films, but you'll have to send me the name of that film later on, because I'd be curious to see it.
It's a film called Sholay. I'll send you a link. It's probably on
Okay.
YouTube somewhere. I'll share it with you.
Okay.
Super. Since we started talking about watching films, there's another connection I'd like to draw attention to, just as you spoke of the Western, the spaghetti Western. The other thing I think that Indian readers will be curious about is the fact that English is a kind of second language, or perhaps a companion language for you, along with your mother tongue, right? And I read about your having started work in your mother tongue with graphic narratives, and then having moved it over along to English. So I'm a little curious about how that works for you, right? How do you move between these two languages? What's your relationship with these languages like?
Okay. Well, originally I'm from Malta, and my Maltese isn't that great, I have to say. I can get by when I'm there, and I do. But I did comics in Malta a long time ago, and they were called Imhab Bavera, which means true love. And so I wrote them in English, and then I had a cousin translate them into Maltese, because I can speak Maltese okay, but my written is really poor. My written skills are almost non-existent. And recently I've been reading. My mother's quite elderly, and I read to her in Maltese, and she used to be a teacher, so she's constantly correcting me and helping me with the grammar. So I would say I'm proficient in English. Maltese I can get by in. So I wouldn't call myself fluent by any stretch.
But does the Maltese or the Maltese you heard growing up, does it shape the sentences you write? Does it cast a shadow of any kind on the way you write in English?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, culturally, I'm sure there's some things that I've picked up that influence my work or influence the topics I'm interested in, but not specifically from the language itself. The grammar is like Arabic grammar. It's sort of an offshoot of the Arabic tongue. So it's quite different from English.
Okay, right. Another question I have is about the process of reading. What kind of reader are you? Are you a maker of notes? Are you somebody who's okay with interrupting their reading to jot down things you've come across, or are you somebody likes to finish
I take
and
a
then
lot of notes.
Okay.
I'll show you something. Okay, I have a packet here. I just finished reading some Plato.
Okay.
So I have a packet of notes, these little notes, just one after another. So I'm constantly writing down. Quotes that interest me, or if I have a point of my own to make. But I'm always taking notes. I mean, to me, reading and writing are kind of they weave together. I read a fair amount, and I do read a fair amount. So I might spend an hour reading a book, of which 20 minutes is taking notes. So it's the two things go hand in hand. And I have to say, I seldom pick up a book without a pencil.
Okay. All right. That's fascinating to know, because one of the things I was taught as a young man trying to read academic stuff, trying to read well, was that I should never let the trance of reading be interrupted by such things as having to make notes, that I must wait to finish the book and then go back and rework, work my way through what I'd missed or what I wanted to check. But I always thought it was such a waste of all the lovely ideas that came up in the conversation between the book and you, or the conversations that it started for you. Right? Fascinating to hear. I'd like to take our conversation along one track, one tack specific to this genre that we're talking about. You bring graphic narratives and journalism together. And one of the things that our students are very curious about, because they hear these terms being used a lot, right? The terms comics and the graphic novel, right? And I've heard interesting variations on, how people look at this distinction. There are people who say there's no real distinction between the two, and there are some who would say that, that they vote for the term graphic novel to suggest a certain kind of steadfastness of purpose or a certain political intent, and that the term comic seems to take away from it. So I'm just curious, where are you on this spectrum? Where would you place yourself?
Well, someone my age grew up with the term comics, so they're always comics to me, whether they are those old floppy 32-page sort of magazine looking things, or whether they are in a hardbound book in a bookstore. To me, it's all comics. Mm-hmm. Graphic novel is essentially the same thing, except you expect it in a bookstore. It's a graphic novel does have, to me, it's a marketing term. It's to make adults feel like it's not a comic book, when to me, a graphic novel is just kind of a very thick comic book, often in a hardcover. But, everyone calls them graphic novels now. So that battle that some of us who are older used to wage against the term, we lost it. Okay. So even I use the expression now, because at some point you run up the white flag.
Okay. So you're saying that you're fine with the term comics, that you're closer to the...
I'm closer. And I understand, like, if I really thought about what the word meant, I'd begin to question why it's called comics. Mm-hmm. But then what about graphic novel? Most of what I do is, it's nonfiction. Mm-hmm. So novel, to me, sort of posits fiction. So I don't think of to me, it's just a term that we've all fallen into. It's it's another mislabeling.
Okay.
It's all mislabeling, but then that's what you call it.
Yeah. All right. But I think one distinction that I noticed was that a lot of the time when you're saying comics, what you're really talking about is a massive team effort, right? And that also sort of produces a certain streamlined form of narrative where speech balloons work a certain way, where the framing of the narrative works a certain way. But the interesting thing with the graphic novel is that there seems to be a lot more freedom for the individual artist. And in some sense, it seems to be more the work of an individual artist. So that's not true anymore. But if you look at the work of an Art Spiegelman, or even your own work, your drawing and your writing, and the two things become indistinguishable from each other. Whereas with comics produced by, let's say, something like the Archie comics, which we all grew up reading for some reason in India, all these are produced by departments coming together. So the departmental idea seems to depart a little bit with the...
Right.
What do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, if you look at a lot of the superhero comics, which I don't have much interest in, but I realize they're part of the ecology of what's made even my career possible. There's a writer, there's someone who pencils the drawings, there's someone who inks the drawings, there's a colorist, there's an editor. You see this long list of names. They're basically a corporate product. It doesn't mean that there's not artistry and that the artists try to make them into something artistic. Sure. But it's a corporate product that has to be done in certain ways. But then in the independent or alternative comics world, which is where I'd place myself, yes, generally speaking, one individual does both jobs, writing and drawing. And you're right, they're not really thought of. They're not really, you can't really separate them in a way. You can, in that, for example, I will write a whole script and then I'll draw. So you can say, well, I do writing, then I do drawing. But actually, when I'm doing the drawing, I'm constantly taking out words that I realize the drawings can explain. There's a lot that works sort of, they work together. They really work together, or they should. And so sometimes people say, what would you do if you couldn't draw? And I'd say, well, I'd write, but then I am worried that I wouldn't be a good writer because I think comics, or I think graphic novels, or whatever you want to call it. That's how I think. Even just passing someone on the street, if we have a conversation, when I think about how I would depict that, I'm thinking visually and with the words too. You know, it's not, my brain is now wired that way. Over time, it's just become completely wired where they're inseparable, writing and drawing.
Okay. One thing I'd also like to say is, I'd like to share my own experience of reading you for the first time. This happened about 17, 18 years ago. I came across Safe Area Gorazde because a new bookstore had a new trade category that they had offered readers, and this was called the graphic novel. And I began reading it. And the first thing that struck me was the tremendous intimacy that I felt with the text, because I felt I was reading your handwriting. Right? It wasn't cold print. It felt like I was reading your notebooks. I arrived at a kind of, I mean, I wasn't friends with you, but I felt somehow that, you know, we achieved a kind of companionship, a kind of intimacy practically. And so for me, what I meant when I said that the words and the visuals, one of the things I meant was that the reassurance that handwriting, or what seems like handwriting on the page, offers one is also a very visual experience, right? It's part of the this interweaving of the visual and the textual, right? And I think it returns us to some place where, you know, we start seeing connections between experiences and letters, experiences and shapes, and so on. But that is just something that struck me randomly.
No, but
I'd like to talk about. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's interesting, because I think the handwriting, I mean, to me, it's an organic whole, and the more organic, the better. So I think you're completely right. The handwriting is part of it's the writing and the drawing in a certain sense. I mean, someone's handwriting is a form of drawing. I mean, it's calligraphy, I guess you could say, which is the art of drawing. So I think there's definitely a truth in what you're saying. A lot of cartoonists now, they use computer fonts, and I always, no matter how good the art is, no matter how good the writing is, when I'm actually reading, I feel like I'm sitting on a refrigerator. Like it's got this cold, there's a coldness about the balloons, you know, those things. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. The thing I wanted to also open up was we began talking about Safe Area Gorazde. And what I wanted to do was thank you for the number of perspectives it opened up for me. Sitting in India, we hear only one kind of account, and at least in the early 2000s, we heard only mainstream accounts of what had happened, you know, in the Yugoslavian conflict, in Bosnia, in places like Gorazde. And what your graphic novel did for me, what Safe Area Gorazde did for me, was sort of take me into that world in a very, very comprehensive way, in a way that I wouldn't have actually got even from a very good journalistic account, or from a very well done, competent historian's effort. And I think the thing it did was, again, this intimacy that I'm talking about. Right? The way you draw these conversations, I find very fascinating, because it's very overwhelming at one level, but it sort of represents that conversation where you're looking at somebody and you can see them reliving that experience, or see them making sense of the history that has passed them by. And I'm very curious about how you deal with the weight of these narratives. does it drive you to write? Do you find yourself sometimes, held so much by the weight of what you've heard that you're unable to progress? What is the mechanism by which you deal with this?
A martini. Well, yeah, over time, I mean, I've kind of wanted to get away from conflict, writing about conflict. Once I've committed to a project, I really feel like it's my responsibility to continue with it, because people opened up their hearts to me. Often they're opening up their hearts to me, and they're telling me sometimes traumatic stories about their experiences. And so it's kind of incumbent upon me to honor that and honor the fact that they told me these things, and complete doing that work. So over time, I mean, a recent book I did was about Indigenous people in Canada. And one of the reasons I did it, it's about resource extraction and Indigenous people, how they relate, basically. And one of the reasons I did it was to get away from straight conflict reporting. But unfortunately, I found out what happened there was just this violence psychologically, sort of the colonialism and the way people were treated, forced to speak English, taken away from their parents and raised in boarding schools. The way the Canadian government, like a lot of colonial governments with Indigenous people, tries to break the culture of the Indigenous people to get ownership of the land, break that connection between Indigenous people and the land. So I found that you can't really get away from those heavy topics in a way. I do work on some side projects that are lighthearted. I won't even say lighthearted. That's the wrong word. They're darkly humorous. Okay. So a lot of the things that I wouldn't call journalism, I have a very sort of darkly humorous attitude about a lot of things, but I don't express that in the journalism that much. Sometimes it creeps in.
Okay. You came to India once or twice. I'm curious about, I've read the works that you've put into journalism, but I'm curious about what your sense of India was. Did you feel this same sense of impending violence or psychological violence in your meetings? Were there other experiences you'd like to share with us? I'm sure our listeners are also curious about it.
Well, I mean, India is such a big place. It's hard to say what is India, or my experience would be very, very, very limited to the places I've gone to and my understanding as a Western person in those situations. But yes, I mean, the place is kind of pregnant with violence. I see India, and it's more in relief in India. But I look at the United States, and I think violence is simmering right under the surface here too. Political violence is simmering under the surface here. And at some point, it has already expressed itself. It might express itself more fully. So in India, definitely, one thing I appreciated about people in India, they didn't try to hide their viewpoints. Okay. People were much more expressive if they didn't like something, or if they didn't like someone, or if they didn't like a whole people. They sort of let you know. They didn't try to hide it. So in some ways, I felt it was a bit more, I could get my head around it easier somehow. But I mean, there's so much about India I like. So this is I'm just talking about I feel like what I saw in India is part of the human condition. And I see it around me, even here too, as I said.
All right. I like the point you're making about this violence simmering under the veneer of an everyday calm. And I think one of the things that your narratives do for a lot of us is sort of allow us to see where what we see as inexplicable violence comes from. It allows us to see the connections between ordinary things, between ordinary events and occurrences, and how they build up to something. Achebe has this brilliant essay called "The Novelist as Teacher," and I think that's something that your narratives have done for me quite systematically, quite regularly. I'd like to. It's a debt I owe you to thank you for those experiences of clarity. But you're also talking about being able to acknowledge politics and to deal with politics. And I'm wondering, in your references to India and about people being upfront about hostilities and things like that, are you also referring to perhaps the fact that a sort of a repressively polite discourse is often the norm in several places, and that means that people are saying the right things but hiding true intent. Are you?
I think that's true in the. Yeah, I think that's more true in the West.
Okay.
That's what I mean. I mean, it's the same. People have the same feelings, but they know that they have to express them in certain ways, and they're quite clever about expressing them in certain ways. But I mean, if you really look deeply in what they're saying, they're looking to divide people, and some form of violence can help people's political career, and they can be out of the, a politician can say something that leads to some violence, but can say it in a way that wouldn't necessarily implicate him or her in a court of law. Let's say that. People are very good at that sort of thing in other places.
I guess we are seeing that become a part of the political order now, this gradated use of language that can't be traced back but is part of the violence and is fueling violence in specific ways. I'll just ask you one more question, but before that, let me just share with you one little thing that your comment on handwriting reminded me of. It came in and went, and it just came back to me again. If you probably come across Gandhi and his ideas, but one of the things that Gandhi talks about in his autobiography is the terrible handwriting he had while he learned to write in English, and how it continued to plague him through life. Right, and his understanding of it when he tried to figure out why his own handwriting was so bad was apparently because he'd been forced to write in English, forced to learn to write letters. And his prescription, the prescription that he shared with young parents at that point, was for people to just start drawing and to let drawing lead to writing. So the way you talked about writing reminded me of that moment in Gandhi's autobiography. I just thought I'd lob it in.
That's great.
Right. I read in one of the interviews you gave of growing up in a household where your parents were socialists, right? So I'm a little curious about that, because India is a place where socialism continues to survive in various odd ways, right? So I think I'm curious from that experience about what this formative experience was like, and how much of it you carry with you, and how it's possible for you to carry that with you in a very vehemently capitalist place like the United States.
Right. Yeah, my dad was part of the Malta Labour Party.
Okay.
So he was a socialist. I'd say my mom was relatively apolitical.
Okay.
And is apolitical. But I learned, my dad used to talk about workers a lot, and the process of working. So I always reflected on that as growing up. Yeah, I would say when I was younger, I was going more with the flow. Growing up in the United States, I went more with the flow. I was kind of on a capitalist track, I suppose. But over time, my own reading, the fact that my father opened up the possibility that one could be a socialist, all those things sort of went together, and yeah, definitely I went in a socialist direction. And I know India has a number of places, states that have even a communist government in Kerala. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and other places, I know that the Communist Party and socialists have a big draw, and yeah, I don't see any way around that socialism if we're talking about very large human societies. Otherwise, if they were small, I'd probably be an anarchist. If they were small, if we were in small groups, but with large groups, and as far as organization goes, socialism all the way.
Right. In India, it's a matter of debate. In the 70s, we added the word socialist to our constitution, right? And people wanted removed. The new political order doesn't like that very much. But the politics of India tends to be socialist because of our great inequalities and our great injustices that come from these inequalities. All right. My last question for you today, Joe, is about journalism, the thing that you brought up several times. Your work with journalism has essentially pushed the practices, pushed the field, pushed the practices that have traditionally defined the field, because you're there in the narrative that you're producing. You're part of the authenticity of the narrative, right? Your voice is the definitive voice. It's the voice through which we meet all the other voices that you bring in, all the other experiences that you bring in. And for me, that's one of the reassuring things about your writing, that it shows all of us possibilities in journalism. In India, what we are expressing is a withdrawal of public trust in journalism for various reasons, right? Some to do with the fact that journalism is seen as too closely connected with those who chase after power and those who wield money and influence. What are your thoughts on some of the ways in which journalism can win back such a trust? And would you agree with the view that perhaps journalism has in some ways squandered this public goodwill and this public trust in some form?
Well, absolutely. And the same is true in the West, and in particular the United States. A lot of people have no trust in journalists, no trust in the profession or in the institutions, no trust in even the mainstream media. And I think the mainstream media has they deserve the blame. I mean, they are exactly also, they're part of the power structure. You less and less do you find journalists pushing up against power. They're at the same parties in the same big cities. But I've always felt that journalism is at its core and should be a very noble profession. And I think, that book you mentioned, Journalism, that I did, it's an anthology. If I had to give it another title, and I should at some point, I would call it reporting. Because to me, there's a distinction between those who are in newspapers and on TV and those who actually go on the ground to talk to people and find out what people think. And so it's reporting that I'm interested in. And if what journalism needs is more reporting, it needs people. The journalist has to go in. It doesn't mean you should be objective in that American way of framing everything, but you have to look at things very honestly and allow yourself to be surprised by what you're hearing and to change your own views about things. That to me is good journalism. When you go and you realize, oh, it's not exactly what I thought it was going to be, and you acknowledge that in your work somehow. So to me, journalism should be getting on the ground and finding out what's really going on. So I call it reporting more than I call it journalism.
I think the little that you said just now will sort of be something that will ring in the ears of many of our students who are learning journalism and asking themselves questions about writing and about how to practice journalism. Thank you for those words.
Oh, sure.
We'll now, thanks a lot for all your responses, Joe. We'll just check quickly if there are questions from the many people who are listening to us. those who are in the meeting, if you have questions. Okay, there are some questions turning up. Okay, Tanishk has this question for you. It's in the chat. I'll just call it out for those who can't see it. Are there comic panels or shots that have stayed with you? Like when you first came across them, they had an intense influence on you as a person and as an artist. If yes, could you tell us more about it? Oh, this question has come to us from YouTube. Gayatri asks this question. So are there comic panels or frames that have stayed with you and have sort of continued to influence you?
You know, I wouldn't say comics panels, not any specific panels, but some artists that you wouldn't normally think of as associated with journalism or nonfiction. There was a cartoonist, well, of course, there's Robert Crumb, the American underground cartoonist. They were very, what stayed with me with a cartoonist like that was the very organic nature of the way he drew everything, every physical object, a coffee cup, a lampshade, everything was drawn in a way where you felt that object had a soul. And that was very influential. I always wanted to draw things, let's say, warmly, in a warm way. There's another cartoonist from the 1950s named Bill Elder, and his backgrounds were very busy. No matter what was going on in the foreground, and he was writing for Mad Magazine or Mad Comics, and he was funny, very funny. But whatever was going on in the foreground was always being subverted in the background, and there were 20, 30 other little small things going on in the background that got your attention. So I think that influenced me as far as my very detailed style, where what was going on in the background really matters to me. So that's maybe, I hope that'll answer some part of that question.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots of questions have come in now. This is from Karthik. It's a question more on the form of your writing rather than the nature. How do you juggle between how much your pictures do the talking versus the speech bubble, or the other text around your drawings?
Over time, that's changed. The first sort of large collection of journalism I did was called Palestine. And looking back on it, I think there were just too many words on a page. Sometimes the words, I won't say debilitated, but overshadowed. The amount of text overshadowed the drawing. Over time, I've been much more careful about that. And so my books have gotten a bit longer, maybe even with less words. So it's a question of, it's not one I can sort of put my finger on and say there's a formula to it. It's just over time you realize where you went a bit wrong and how you can improve your own work. I mean, you're always learning.
Okay. That's a great response, Joe, that we're always learning. Something that teachers like me need to remember. We get too fond of the voice of authority. My colleague Cherian has a question for you. Do you take the help of photography as a way of making a quick record for later graphic elaboration, and analogous to the sketches a master painter makes as a stepping stone?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm so focused on talking to people and getting their stories right that I'm not sketching. So I'm always taking photos for reference. I take photos of the people I talk to if they give me permission. So yes, you're right. I use the camera all the time. Though I do know a lot of cartoonists who started doing journalism and they sketch. And one of the reasons they sketch is that it opens up a conversation with people. People want to know what they're sketching, and they start talking to them based on their drawings. But and that's good, because I think there's no one way of doing this. And my way just happens to be, my way.
All right.
Not the right way necessarily.
Rosemary has this question for you. How and when do you decide to place yourself on the panels of your graphic novels, which for us is an exercise of seeing through you to seeing with you?
I have to admit, I never really had a theory behind why I put myself in the drawings. My earlier comics were autobiographical. And so drawing myself in a story was sort of secondhand to me. So when I went to the Palestinian territories to do what became a journalism book, I actually thought of it more as of a travelogue at the beginning. Like, this is my experiences in this place. But because I'd studied journalism, that journalism part of me just kicked in, and I started asking questions, interviewing people. And so the book became journalistic, and the process became journalistic. But I still drew myself because that was a holdover from the autobiographical side. So I never really thought it through, what I was doing. It's only later that I realized the good thing about that is it helps the reader see that this is the viewpoint of one person telling the story, rather than this unseen voice, demigod voice of authority. I'm not that. You can see I'm a small guy, flawed human being. I make mistakes. That's part of it to me. Also, I think it's important I realize there are many stories you couldn't tell without putting yourself in it. You mentioned Safe Area Garajda. People were giving me letters to take back and forth across the front lines to people they hadn't seen in 3.5 years. I could go because I could get on a convoy, whereas they were trapped in certain areas. So I was delivering mail from husbands to wives who hadn't seen each other, bringing packages, bringing gifts back and forth. How can you write yourself out of that story? You in some ways you become part of the story too.
Yeah, that reminds me of a question one of my colleagues wanted to ask you. This is my colleague Nikita. She would have asked you this question if she was here. And she observed that when you draw yourself, you seem to draw yourself in a very unflattering light. And so when she finally saw a photograph of you, she was very surprised, because she felt you were quite handsome, and there was a very deliberate way in which you were, drawing yourself in a manner that was unflattering, she felt. Would you like to answer that question for her?
Yeah, it's so other people have pointed that out. Basically, I never trained as an artist, so I never really trained how to draw the human figure, the human face, nothing. I was a cartoonist that used the so-called Bigfoot style, which is you draw everything in an exaggerated way, floppy arms, big noses, facial features that were a little grotesque. When I started doing the journalism work, I realized if this had sort of a pretense of journalism, I had to try to draw more realistically. I had to try to draw the people, and especially the people in a more representational way, which I forced my hand to do. To this day, it's uncomfortable. But I kind of ignored my own character, my own figure. I actually didn't pay attention to it. I think it became such shorthand that I didn't think, I need to also make myself a little more good looking or something. I just was the same old strange looking character, which is fine with me. I've moderated it over time. I'm not that bad looking now, and I draw myself a little more handsome.
I'll carry that message to her.
Okay.
My colleague Vijeta has this question. What advice would you give to someone who collects stories but is afraid to begin the process of putting them together in a book or somewhere they can just be?
Well, the way I think of stories and how to tell them, just to get started, I often think if I was sitting across a table from someone, what would they want to know, and how would I try to explain it so they would understand? And for example, I'm working with very sometimes complex political formulations or ideas or just sheer politics. But you realize there's only so much information people can take. They can take more than you think they can take, but you have to do it in a way that is friendly. So I think of my works as sort of dining room conversational books.
Okay.
And it might be easier rather than, yeah, I don't have a prescription really, but it might be easier to think of what would you tell a friend if you have a story to tell, even if it's fiction, how would you explain it to a friend? Just clearly, of course, you try to be a little amusing. You might exaggerate a couple of things, who knows, it's fiction. But you would want the person to keep engaged. And that's what little advice I have on that, I'm afraid.
I think what you're saying is that we're all natural storytellers and that we should
think of it ourselves that way.
Yeah, okay. A lot more questions. I'll try to get through them quickly.
Okay.
What does it look like to navigate ethics and gaze and practice? What is your personal code for navigating these power imbalances? This is someone who calls themselves Thunder the Starbug.
Well, Thunder the Starbug, that's a very good question. It's something you have to think about all the time. The main thing for me is to let people tell their own stories, not try to iron out differences between stories. There are often contradictions, even when people are telling the same story. Let those contradictions exist, because often the story arc is the same, but there is some differences in how people tell stories. So I try as much as possible to just let people say what they want to say. I had this particular issue came up a lot when I was in Canada, because a lot of Indigenous people and people who advocate for Indigenous people are very concerned that someone from outside a particular community comes in and writes their story. But so I never think of myself as writing their story, and I never even think of myself as giving them voice. I've never liked that phrase, like you give voice to the voiceless. People have a voice. I sort of give an ear to those people who have a voice that no one really listens to. That's kind of how I try to think about it.
All right. Here's a question from Monami Roy. She says, can you tell us more about the organic way of creating your drawn documents? She finds it very interesting.
Well, partly to keep them organic, I try to be spontaneous. As I mentioned, the script might have been written, but then every day I have a page in front of me, let's say a blank sheet, and I look at the script and I decide that moment what I'm going to put on the page and how I'm going to put it. Because I find that just the act of thinking quickly, coming up with these, how I'm going to design a page, gives it a more organic feel than being very academic about it, thinking about the theory of how I'm going to draw it. This is a detail that I'll share with you. I write the words on a piece of paper, and then I cut them out like the balloons as they would appear. I cut them out and I place them on the page. I put the words down before I even draw anything. And I use the words where the bubbles are to lead the eye. And then I sort of do the drawings around that. There are many ways to make things organic, and I think you've got to come up with your own, everyone has to come up with their own formulations for that.
All right. Tanishq has a question. You said that you'd rather stick with drawing than pursue a career in filmmaking. I want to know what you think about cartoon films, not necessarily Pixar style, but perhaps just rough drawings that are still moving.
Well, I'm not saying it can't be done well, because I think, I don't know if Tanishq, if I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you've seen the film Persepolis, that's based on a comic book, Persepolis, which is a great book about a girl growing up during the Iranian Revolution. And she made that book into a film, and she was sort of in charge of the film. She really hands-on. She was very hands-on, and I think the film is a bit better than the book. The book is fantastic, but the film even goes just one step beyond that. So it's not as if it can't be done really well. I really like working by myself with my own, a piece of paper with some music on. And I think with film, you really need a lot of people involved, and a lot of people like to collaborate. I prefer to sort of just do things myself. So that's probably one of the reasons that film doesn't appeal to me.
That's one way of thinking about it. Would you be more comfortable working by yourself or with other people?
I've worked with other people and it can be a good experience, but in the end, I just prefer doing my own thing, let's say.
Okay. Here's a question that is also a compliment. Joe Sacco, how do you take an issue such as the Israel-Palestine conflict and portray it with a humane, witty touch, like in Footnotes in Gaza? How do we add the humane touch to journalism? This is a mysterious SZ asking the question.
SZ. Well, SZ, I think the human touch is by introducing your readers to the people you're writing about. So I meet a lot of people, and a lot of them are really engaging. I like them as people, and I feel I want to have my reader meet those people and get to know them too. So I think the process of just standing out of the way of that person's character and what they're like and what they're saying and their sense of humor, that really can help.
Okay. One more set of initials. This is an MM who says, could you speak about people to trust you in a completely foreign space where you, by the virtue of your identity, must appear foreign? Should I?
Oh, you were cutting out a bit. Was it about trust? How do I get people to trust me?
I'll try to read it out the question. Is the connection better now?
It's better.
Yeah. Could you speak about the highlights and lowlights of getting people to trust you in a completely foreign space where you, by the virtue of your identity, must appear foreign?
Well, I often rely on people's hospitality. And I've generally found a lot of hospitality. A lot is just sort of how you're brought up. I don't think there's something that you can learn, like the 10 ways to get people to relax with you. I don't think it works that way. I think it does depend on your individual nature. I'm generally a friendly person. I generally okay, I'll tell you, the secret of journalism is that people like to talk about themselves and they like to be listened to. And if you know that, and you know that actually everyone has a story, everyone has a very interesting story. And if you give them the chance to say that, to tell their truth, they will appreciate you as an outsider, because a lot of people don't get to tell their stories. I was in southern Russia doing a story about Chechen refugees, and it was about women. I didn't want to talk to the men. The men would often push themselves forward to talk, but I said, I really would like to speak to the woman here. And they never had really been considered in that way, I think, so they were really appreciative, and they told me things that were very genuine.
Your drawings are quite caricaturesque, says Muhammad Jafar. What effect do you intend to have on the reader?
Arul, are you there? I've lost you, it seems.
Hi, sir. We'll just wait for a second for him to come back. I think the connection is just a little bad.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about this.
That's okay. Are you trying to restore it?
Oh, yes.
Thank
Just
you.
a minute. Yeah, I think he's gotten logged out. We'll just get him back in.
Okay.
What is your password for this?
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, I think I lost connectivity for a moment.
Okay. Thank you for putting us together again.
Yeah. I'll just get back to the questions. Tanish, can you post the questions again? We seem to have lost the questions. Okay, I'll repeat Jafar's question, Muhammad Jafar's question for you because I remember it. He said your drawings are quite caricaturesque. Is there a specific effect you intend to have through that choice? Or is this natural style of drawing that stayed with you?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I've tried to draw more representationally, but my hand will only allow me to go so far. So there's always going to be an element of caricature in my drawings, sort of mixed in with the representation. Over time, like I say, I've tried to push myself representationally more in that direction, but I'll never get the caricature component out of my drawing hand, which has its own brain, really.
Never heard it described that way. The hand that has a mind of its own. Right. Tanish, do we have any more questions? Oh, there are one or two. Vignesh has this question. We're often told growing up that comics, novels, and cinema have little to do with reality. Did you grow up in a similar way? How did you arrive at drawing your reporting?
Well, I arrived at drawing my reporting because even though I had got a degree in journalism, I couldn't find a job with a newspaper. And anything that was remotely journalistic job that I got, I didn't like. So I pushed myself in a lot of different directions and ended up falling back on comics, which I'd been doing since I was a kid. So I always thought of them as just, they were always part of my life. I never really separated them from reality in the sense that I always thought they were very good ways of telling a story. And at some point I realized they were good ways of telling a real story, and but with journalism, I had to acknowledge that the drawings were always subjective. No matter how, even if I saw something with my own eyes, I would draw it differently from another artist. So there's a subjective nature to the drawing. And also when I'm drawing things in the past, I have to put some things together as I think they would have happened, with as much visual information as possible to aid me. But so that subjective nature is sort of conflicts or is in tension with the reality of the journalism, which is, these are quotes are accurate. This is what that person said. I'm not trying to misrepresent this in any way. These characters actually exist. These people exist. I'm not making composite characters. There's a tension between the reality and the subjectivity in a sense, but I think that's part of the magic of it. And that's what gives it sort of life and lets it breathe.
Okay, Archa has a question for you. She says there's a distinctness in your line work, especially in terms of characterization and framing. Is this deliberate or something that comes naturally through sketching?
Well, I don't sketch that much, so everything ends up being deliberate, but it's deliberate over time where things change naturally without you really thinking about it. I remember when I was younger, I looked at the drawings of Robert Crumb, and I thought he was using a crow quill, which is one of those pens you dip into ink, and then you scratch out some lines, and then you dip it again. And so I took it up because I wanted to be like Robert Crumb. I wanted to get his expressiveness of line in my drawing. Later, I found out he uses a technical rapidograph pen, which is has a consistent line, but he manages somehow to get something out of it I never could. So sometimes our choices are, we make the wrong choice in a certain way, but they end up in our favor.
That's an interesting answer.
Yeah.
Ananya has this question. Do you see your novels becoming movies? What kind of movies would they be?
Well, like I said, I'm not like dying to have them made into movies, but Footnotes in Gaza, there was a French production company that was working very hard to get that made. They asked me if I wanted to direct, and I said no. And they asked me if I wanted to write the script, and I said no. But they got other people to do that work. That would have been an animated film. They thought that was the way to go. And the way I thought of it is, I'm curious to what they would produce, but it would be a very separate entity from my book. That it would be the vision of people using my book. And I sort of wanted to separate myself. Now that project, for various reasons, didn't go, it went on for a couple of years and then it stopped. But I think I would have a very distant approach with film if a film was ever going to be made of one of my books.
It sounds like you see it as a form of translation more than anything else.
Yeah.
Vijeta has a message for you. She says, I read 2 books written by you, Palestine and Paying the Land. Seeing you in person today feels like I'm seeing my favorite cartoon character come to life. Thank you for the advice and the insights. Sukrit Nagaraj has a question, a very specific question for you. He says, can we expect more books like Notes from a Defeatist?
You can. That's I want to finish the book I'm doing on India now. I might have another journalism book in me at some point, but I'm really working on something that is much more humorous. It's actually very serious, but humorous. It's more philosophical, and it's all the ideas I've had in my head that you can't really put in a book of journalism. I mean, journalism, you really have to stick to some facts. And that's why I've always envied fiction writer, because like a journalist can put down these dots, but the fiction writer can kind of connect the dots. And I want to do some of my own connecting.
Sambhavi has this observation to make and a question. I love how you don't color the pictures and record your temperamental stagnancies when things don't work, when you hit a roadblock, for example. The I in your story, why is that made significant in your novels?
The I mean the actual I?
No, the I, the person.
The person.
Yes.
Why is it significant?
Why is it made significant?
Well, as I said before, the figure, the drawing of myself is a clue to the reader that this is not an objective experience that they're seeing. It's important for me to let the reader know there are many ways of looking at certain situations, and every journalist has their own take. They might, to me, it goes against the American style journalism that I was taught, where you have to be objective. And this idea that you should, there are 2 sides of every story, and the middle is where the truth resides, which I just don't really believe that's true. I think we all go in with certain prejudices going into a story. When I'm in India, I'm a Westerner in India. You should see that I am the other in that situation. And so you should judge my work based on the fact that, well, this is a Westerner talking to Indian people. That might have its advantages, it might have its disadvantages. And even if I think there's no prejudice I'm bringing into a story myself, it allows the reader to evaluate that for themselves. All right.
I think somewhere in somebody's question, there's also the idea that the other question that in choosing to keep it black and white, is there a kind of documentary seriousness that enters the work? Does it allow you to keep the reader's eye on the visual?
If only that were true. If only that were true.
Okay.
You know, a lot of things are either accidental or have to do with my own particular limitations.
Mhm.
And in this case, this has to do with my limitation.
Okay.
When I started doing comics, everyone was doing black and white comics in the independent comics scene. It was just cheaper to produce. As an economy developed around those things, color could be used. And most of my peers switched to doing color work and are quite good at it. I have never even learned how to use Photoshop. So my brain doesn't work that way. It's a limitation of mine. I just never learned how to use color. So I use black and white. Your limitation becomes your style somehow. And then you learn to use black and white to its best advantage. And I hope over time I've learned that. And now I really prefer it. I would never switch to color. I think in black and white now. So I love the hatching. I love all the texture you can get with black and white. You know, with color, you could just lay down a color on something and it's done. With my work, you really have to texture it. And there's a real meditative process in doing that I enjoy. The drawing isn't always intense. Sometimes there are long periods where I'm just doing the texture of a wall or something like that, where I can kind of be a little zone out, be a little zen about it.
All right. That's a fascinating set of observations. I like the bit about one's limitation becoming one's style. I think many of us who struggle with writing will take heart from that statement. Anupriya has a question. She's a bit of a musician, and so she has this question which says, do you draw inspiration from music as well? What kind of music inspires you the most? And what kind of music do you listen to as well?
Well, it depends what I'm doing. When I'm writing, I don't listen to anything. I just really have to have a clear mind. When I'm drawing, I listen to a lot of instrumental music generally. I listen to a lot of Brian Eno. His music really appeals to me because it's actually quite interesting, but it doesn't infringe on you in this way. When I'm inking, which takes, let's say, a slightly less amount of brain power, I'm listening to anything from jazz, blues, rock, classical. Yeah, you know, certain musicians inspire me. I'll tell you, Miles Davis really inspires me because he had several different careers in music. He approached things probably 3 or 4 times in 3 or 4 different directions and really sort of changed not just himself, but music, I think. And I've always liked that. I've always liked someone who has an ability to have done something and then moved on once they've accomplished what they've done. And there was earlier question about, am I going to do something like Notes from a Defeatist? I want to get back to the really more humorous, satirical side of my nature. I want to switch gears at some point. So I do have inspiration from musicians and even their careers.
I like the point you're making about Miles Davis having restarted or gone back to directions he'd given up. That's a
right
good observation. Archa says, I've had so many conversations about your work, art, and journalistic comics while teaching Palestine in class. This feels unreal to have you answer some of the questions that we discussed. Okay, so that's a compliment, Joe.
Well, I'm very happy to talk to all of you. It's actually a real pleasure for me, and it's an honor. So I appreciate this invitation.
Thank you. So there's one last question, and we'll close today. In what ways is it possible for fiction to become a part of journalism? Tanvi has this question over you.
I think there are attributes of fiction you can bring to journalism, but I mean, ultimately, journalism has to be reality-based. You can do good fiction based on reality, but I don't know if you can do journalism that has elements of fiction in it. Though, no, I shouldn't say that. I think there are some journalists who've experimented with that. There's a Polish writer named Rudyard Kapuscinski, and I would say that his journalism was mixed in with fiction. I wasn't sure if what he was talking about was reality in a sense. And I think what he was trying to do, to me, with the caveat that it wasn't strictly journalism, is get the reader to the essential truth, to do some of that connecting of the dots that most of the journalists feel very shy to do or don't think it's right to do. But, you know, the empty page, you can do anything with it. I wouldn't label, I'd be careful how you would label it, though.
I like the point, and I think it's a point you made 2 or 3 times during this conversation, that it's possible for the person practicing journalism to have an ambition larger than that of just getting the facts across. That it's possible to say more, to say something distinctively. And I think that's a great message for all of us from you. Right. So thanks a lot, Joe. Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I think many of us are going to go back and listen more carefully to Miles Davis and to look at Bill Elder and some of the others.
Oh, yeah. That's great. That's great.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. It was a real pleasure. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks once again, Joe.
Thank you.